You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Dankman. Just a note that this next segment includes discussion about sexual assault, and we're going to be talking about this story for about the next 30 minutes. Washington State's Special Commitment Center sits on McNeil Island in the Puget Sound. It's operated by the Washington Department of Social and Health Services, and it houses about 150 people who were detained or committed there, sometimes for decades after they committed acts of sexual violence. It is not a criminal facility, but a civil one. There used to be a prison on McNeil, but that closed in 2011. Today, many of the people at the facility on McNeil Island have developmental or other disabilities. They're supposed to be receiving sex offender treatment. Some lack the ability to understand that treatment or the implications of their actions. While the state keeps people on McNeil Island for fear that they will reoffend, some people at the center have become victims of sexual assault while under state care. A recent investigation by the Seattle Times looked at so-called vulnerable adults at the Special Commitment Center and how the state decides who warrants protection when somebody is both a perpetrator and a victim. Rebecca Moss is an investigative reporter at the Seattle Times, and she writes about McNeil Island in a series that is called Uncommitted. Rebecca, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
We're going to get into the specific story of Alan, whom you followed for this investigation, in just a minute. But first, in general, who are the vulnerable adults who are living on McNeil Island, and how did they get that designation?
So there's a formal designation that the Special Commitment Center makes for people on the island as a vulnerable adult. It's also a legal term used in the state and nation. In Washington, it speaks to somebody who, either because of age or developmental disability or other factors, is unable to either live independently or advocate or protect themselves from harm. And because of that, the state is a mandated reporter. Those who care for them are mandated reporters. And so if there is abuse or neglect, financial exploitation of these people, there is a legal requirement that those who care for them are immediately reporting that type of harm. And so we, in this story, looked at people who are on the island and have that designation and those kind of vulnerabilities in general. And then more broadly, what the state has said are sort of a larger, they call it track of people based on how they go through sex offense treatment, which are people who do have some level of developmental, cognitive, or other disability that requires specialized treatment or accommodations while they're at the facility.
And how many of the people who live on McNeil have either a developmental disability that's been assessed or are specifically vulnerable adults?
1 out of 7 people is fits into that category, according to the data that we looked at from DSHS.
So I want to talk about Alan, and that's not his given name, but you're using that name to protect his privacy. Alan was born in Tenino in kind of the south central part of Washington and in south of Olympia. He had intellectual disabilities, as did other members of his family. You got access to CPS records starting when he was 10 that, saw the state had indicated neglect in the home. You also report that he was allegedly physically and sexually abused by some relatives and likely also by his father. So Alan has an extremely troubled beginning to life. What do we know about his path as a child and teenager where he would eventually end up in state custody? What should people know about how Alan started out in life, Rebecca?
He certainly had a really difficult childhood, and I think it was based on the records that I've reviewed and people I've spoken to, something that was a life that was very difficult, but that also was very quickly looked at in the context of criminality. Pretty much by an early age, there were ways in which he was being put on a certain track because he was acting out in school or acting out sexually. And this is the 80s and early 90s. And I think where disability research was at that time is relevant, where it was as a law was relevant to some degree, and then also how the state did or didn't handle his case even at an early age because their records show really clear signs that there was neglect and abuse in his home, and that there are records that show that it correlated to his behavior acting out. But it looks like his protection was really not considered until he started to hurt other people. And so that was something that was really stark in going through this case was the disconnect between what his behavior was and where it was coming from, and that there was very clear trauma abuse of this person who also has a very severe speech impediment and intellectual disabilities. So at age 12, he was assessed as having the cognitive function of a 5-year-old. But that rarely was seems to be considered according to the records I reviewed.
So Alan, also at age 12, is eventually arrested for assaulting a 3-year-old girl. That's just, the start of some pretty serious sexual assaults that he is involved in both as a minor and then eventually after he turns 18. Tell me what happens with the criminal justice system and Alan. What are his interactions with the courts?
So he has a fairly extensive juvenile record, ultimately removed from his home and placed in juvenile detention, moves through Washington's Child Study and Treatment Center and various elements. And then just 2 months after turning 18, he follows a woman into the woods, according to records, and is accused of raping her. And that's the first time that he sort of faces the criminal justice system as an adult.
And that leads to what becomes a more than 2-decade experience with commitment by the state. Because as a result of that case, in May of 2004, a jury commits Alan to the Special Commitment Center indefinitely, you report. So how is that decision arrived at, that Alan is somebody that has to be committed indefinitely at this point in time? He doesn't go before a jury for a trial because he's not competent for that, but instead he has to be put away and not in the community. How does that decision happen, Rebecca?
Yeah, it's interesting. The records really show that, he gets assessed for whether or not he's competent to stand trial, which is something that think people in Washington in particular are really familiar with because that's been an increasing issue in our state, competency and how that's been dealt with at Western State Hospital with True Blood and various other things. But in his case, he's assessed for competency. The ultimately is found incompetent, and within a day, as these decisions are being made, the state attorney general's office is filing for commitment. So as soon as essentially it appears that he would be released, there are filings to petition for him to be committed. And in that process, he's detained and taken to McNeil Island. And so he's detained for a year there, over a year, before he is actually committed ultimately. And in reviewing those records, we're in the early 2000s, and the disability research is a more muted element of that case. And so what's clear is there's a lot of assessments being done and considerations about his criminality, but what role disability might have played and the incompetence findings and what that will mean if he is then civilly committed to a facility that focuses solely on sex offense treatment seems to have a more minimal focus than that he will be detained.
So the Special Commitment Center on McNeil Island, it houses sex offenders, and the idea is that they're getting treatment, right? I mean, what is the treatment supposed to look like on McNeil, and how does somebody like Alan with severe intellectual disabilities interact with that treatment?
So the idea of the Community Protection Act, which was established in 1990, was that there were people who would have significant treatment requirements, long-standing treatment requirements, and because of what the law calls a mental abnormality, although that is not a psychiatric term, and their past sexual history would be then deemed a sexually violent predator. the law was sort of inspired by people who had been in and out of prison and were released and in and out of institutional settings. And they were looking for a more long-term psychiatric hold, essentially. But what resulted is indefinite detention and a program that is not actually a psychiatric facility, but just focuses on sex offense treatment. And so there's been a lot of lawsuits and contention over what is actually being offered there and how do people leave. And for people who have cognitive disabilities, this has been an even bigger issue because starting in the 1990s and well into 2014, when Disability Rights Washington ultimately investigated the facility, there have been ongoing findings that people with cognitive disabilities were not receiving treatment they could understand and were essentially just being warehoused at the island.
So Alan is there. At this point, we can say it's been 23 years of commitment by the state and almost 20 on McNeil. And during that time, he's not able to fully understand either the charges against him or the treatment that's being offered. And in the meantime, what is Alan's day-to-day life like?
So he is a very young adult when he gets to the island in the first place. And he almost immediately appears to be facing victimization and being targeted in part because of his age and in part because of his developmental disability. So his records show that almost right away, one of the goals that was outlined by the Special Commitment Center for him in his sort of progress in treatment was to avoid victimization. And we reviewed a number of letters and interviewed one of his former guardian ad litems who had, told the court and the Attorney General's office of how frequently she was hearing that he was being harassed and sexually assaulted by other people at the facility. And the records I reviewed, both internal DSHS records, court records, show that that has been an ongoing pattern throughout his commitment, almost, enduringly.
So Alan is basically in a catch-22. He is a vulnerable adult who has severe intellectual disabilities. He cannot show the kind of improvement during sex offender treatment that would allow him to be released from commitment. He's unable to even understand, the course material or what's the reason for his commitment. In effect, what you write, Rebecca, is that Alan is being indefinitely warehoused on McNeil, and his condition starts to worsen. His guardian advocate says that he's not bathing. He tells her that it's become a kind of defense mechanism to prevent assault, that if he becomes disgusting, basically, that the other people on the island will not try to assault him. Meanwhile, Disability Rights Washington is challenging this practice more widely, where people with intellectual disabilities are being committed at the Special Commitment Center on McNeil. And eventually that work by Disability Rights Washington does change something for Alan. So what happens there?
So Disability Rights Washington's essentially creates some oversight of the facility through a settlement agreement it reaches with DSHS. And DSHS starts to put things in place that ultimately, more recently, has created positive behavior support plans for residents and other things that are more supportive of people with disabilities and accommodations for their treatment. But it also leads to more people with disabilities attaining release into supervised community housing while still committed, but under a conditional release program. And that is something that Alan ultimately receives as well, first in 2018 briefly, and then again in 2021.
So he ends up living at a group home in Graham. And this really struck me as just an incredible development for Alan. He's living at this group home in Graham. He picks up some carpentry stuff. He seems to be doing a little better. Somebody who runs the group home ends up noticing that Alan can't see. He's legally blind. And so he gets a pair of glasses for the first time. And that seems to really change a lot for him, because nobody in the course of 2 decades of commitment, or prior to that when he was a child growing up, noticed that he had a sight disability. How can that be, Rebecca?
Yeah, it was a really stark thing to find in the records. I think it was pretty upsetting for the people who I've spoken to about realizing it and noticing that this was something that could be fixed. I think there was a lot of behaviors, a lot of disengagement that were attributed to personality disorders or misbehavior without any assessment of his function, and that he actually did have vision with proper glasses. He still has significant visual impairment, but he essentially from the people I spoke to, he came to the facility without glasses, and it appears that nobody checked until he was at this group home and they started advocating for him to get a eye assessment. And this is according to, the records I look through, both from the Special Commitment Center, from his community sex offense therapist, who does monthly reports to the court, where I can see her now advocating for him to get the correct prescription. And once he does, he's able to function and participate much more in the household, to watch TV, to learn to crochet, and to start engaging with the course material better.
So even as things seem to be getting better for Alan at this group home, he is being victimized again. At the home in Graham, another resident is repeatedly victimizing him and sexually assaulting him. And that leads to the whole group home ending up back on McNeil Island. There is some back and forth. What happens in the interim, Rebecca? I mean, Alan ends up back on McNeil, and then what?
Yeah, the assault at the group home creates a really long period of instability, in which essentially the fight is over. Should he continue to get conditional release, or should he remain on the island now that he's been returned to it? And this is 2023 into 2024. And part of what happens is the state has contended that the group home is no longer safe after this incident, but once he's returned to the island, the same person still has access to him. They're both on the island again together. And
how can that be,
continues.
Rebecca? That was an incredible moment of your reporting. They are returned from the group home to McNeil because Alan is being abused by another resident of the group home. But then that resident has access to Alan when, again, all under the state's care, when they return to McNeil. How can that be? What did the state say about that?
The state said that, they have these conditions in place to inform them when certain residents shouldn't be in contact, and that staff are made aware and do their best to stay vigilant, but that it is a treatment facility and people can largely come and go. They can only do so much to restrict movements. And looking at the records, it's very clear to me. I'm looking at incident reports that there is knowledge in each report. It'll say there is a current condition, a CC in place between these two residents, that they not have contact. But that clearly is not enough to prevent this. And it continues over and over again. And it's something that that I've heard from other residents I've interviewed is a common issue, that when there's CCs are in place, it does not prevent people from experiencing harm that those CCs are intended to prevent.
So during this time, there's a back and forth, as I mentioned, and you write that Alan seems to regress. And there are incidents of acting out as well. For example, he goes to the bathroom in his therapist's office with the door open when a woman is kind of sitting there and can see him in the door to the bathroom. So there are signs that, Alan, while showing some improvement in the group home, is still, struggling with some of the acting out and things like that has been an issue for him over the years, for his whole life. Eventually he's back in the group home in Graham, but then he decides to leave the home. I mean, you got a chance to sort of get more insight into why he decided to leave the group home in Graham. And I do recommend that people read your story, Rebecca, in the Seattle Times, because it's really heart-wrenching. It's basically Alan thinks he can get back home to his childhood home at some point, and he runs away like a kid would by stuffing blankets under his bed, on his bed to look like somebody's there, and he just jumps out the window, and he is arrested soon after that. Now Alan is back on McNeil Island. What is Alan's status today?
When he leaves the group home, it's a hard moment in his case, and I think in part because his defense team really fought to get him back in that house, and it appeared, had wanted to go back to the house. He had attachments to the chickens he was watching, and essentially the state had argued that he was not safe. The state attorney general's office had argued he wasn't safe, and a judge essentially said that they thought he would do better in the group home. And after all of this back and forth, he returns there, and then a couple months after, he leaves again. It's an interesting moment in part because we mentioned this in the story, and spending a lot of time in his records, he has a very long history of running away when he's upset. So it's something that was a known tendency, but I think in interviewing people and talking to people, I think because he had been happy during his first stay there, they hadn't been as alert for it, and there were other elements at play that led to that incident occurring. But yeah, so it's a sort of short-lived victory, and today he is back on the island.
I'm just struck by the difficulty of this case, Rebecca, and you write very eloquently about it, and that is that Alan is somebody who clearly will never be able to be independent, and he also still struggles in many of the ways that he did, with the acting out, at least, from the beginning of his commitment. He is somebody who the state has put through decades of treatment, but there's no way of telling exactly how much he's able to understand. And he has been repeatedly victimized, raped by other people that the state has housed him with. So what does the state do in this situation when somebody may continue to pose a safety risk for the public because they've been a perpetrator in the past and they're maybe not able to absorb the kind of treatment and rehabilitation that the state has tried to impart? But at the same time, they have been abused and victimized so often under the state care. Who knows what effect that has had on this person over the decades? And quite the opposite. I would editorialize quite the opposite of treatment. I mean, how do you approach something when somebody is both a perpetrator, but in this case, very much also a victim?
That's sort of the crucial question in this case, which is essentially the state and taxpayers have been paying for treatment for this person for over 20 years, but the treatment they're paying for is sex offense treatment. So the decision that was made was that because this person had committed sexual violence or was accused of committing sexual violence, and I say that just because he wasn't convicted, rather than treat or look at the whole person, the trauma, the disabilities, things as simple as glasses and vision and speech therapy, the care he was receiving was, according to Disability Rights Washington's own legal complaint and settlement, not something he could benefit from. So I think there is this open question of why this person was placed somewhere where who they were as a person and what their capacity was would not get the type of treatment they needed as a human being. I think these are really complicated questions when it doesn't negate that people have somebody has hurt other people and that that's very real. But when the criminal justice system isn't appropriate, what do we do? And I think his case is quite rare because he is one of very few people who fits into this category in which he was found incompetent and then placed on this track. But it's, I think, pretty clear from his records that there are a lot of services and care and treatment that never happened or very little of which happened. And he was at a place where they didn't exist whatsoever for a long time.
I know that DSHS, the state agency that runs the Special Commitment Center, you spoke with them. There were moments in your reporting where they disputed, for example, the frequency with which certain cases of abuse against Alan had happened. Did they have an overall response about Alan's case and especially about protecting him on the island, or anything that you want to highlight about what they said about this situation in the course of your reporting and when you were engaging with the agency?
I will say that they declined to do an interview with us, which limits our ability to have a comprehensive conversation and with the state and is not our preference as, reporters. We did a lot of back and forth over email about the situation of this case and of the various situations in general that were in records. They disputed the frequency of not just for this individual, but in general, the frequency with which Washington State Patrol records indicated in an email that they were seeing reports of abuse at least once a month, but they were not able to provide comprehensive data to us. They just said they didn't believe that that was accurate. And in terms of Alan's case, we asked them specific questions about scenarios, but in the same way we are protecting his anonymity from the public, we did not give his full name to the state either. We provided lists of incidents that had occurred with this person and asked them to respond to that. So we got email responses that were essentially what they said is they take incidents of reports of abuse and neglect very seriously, and that everyone at the facility is a mandated reporter.
Obviously, Alan's case is an extreme example of somebody who's in a vulnerable situation who's been committed by the state. But there are other adults in this situation. This is not an isolated case. In your reporting, have you heard any convincing suggestions about ways to keep people like Alan safe while also keeping the community safe? Because it strikes me that the infrastructure required, the group homes, did not work for Alan because he was victimized there as well. And then he also ran away because, of a lot of issues. It's not uncommon for somebody with intellectual disabilities to run. I mean, did you hear of any possible solutions here that advocates have been asking for, or, anything that you heard of that could be a fix?
It's interesting in his records as early as 2006, people within the Special Commitment Center actually said, raised questions about why he had been placed there and noting that because of his disability needs, there were other programs in the state that might be more appropriate. His record suggests that maybe a residential facility for people with disabilities, which the state has, might have been a better place. This was just repealed by the legislature, but for years we had something called the Community Protection Program, which was a waiver program for people with developmental disabilities who had also been deemed dangerous in some way by an assessment, but there were a lot of really serious problems with that program as well, although it was less institutionalized and more community-based. I think what his defense team is hoping at a minimum is that he is in an environment where he gets disability support at the level that he requires as the baseline. It's clear that he will need help his entire life. He is not somebody who will be able to live independently. But I think the hope is that holistic needs, not just the community safety, would be considered, that there would be something that looks at both rather than just one piece.
Rebecca Moss is an investigative reporter at the Seattle Times. Read her reporting on Allen and McNeil Island and the issues with the people that are detained or committed there and in the community. It's called Uncommitted, that series. Rebecca, thank you very much. I really appreciate your time today.
Thank you, Libby. I really appreciate you having me on to talk about this.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. Don't forget you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org or on your favorite podcast app.